U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's brief stop in Taiwan has raised tensions in East Asia, and China now says it's cancelling several defence meetings with the United States and also calling off key climate talks with Washington. Meanwhile, Beijing has announced sanctions on Pelosi and her immediate family for seriously interfering with China's internal affairs and undermining China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Pelosi said her visit was about paying respect to the flourishing democracy on the island, which Beijing views as a breakaway province. In response to the trip, China has launched massive military drills around Taiwan. It says the air and sea combat drills were for the purpose of continuously testing the joint combat capabilities of the Chinese armed forces. The Taiwanese Defense Ministry says several Chinese military planes and Navy vessels have crossed into what had been an unofficial buffer zone between China and Taiwan for decades. Speaking to the press in Taipei, the Taiwanese premier called Beijing their evil neighbour.
China is an evil neighbor, showing its military power at the gate of our country, using military exercises to destroy the busiest lanes of international shipping. China's action has received condemnation from neighboring countries and the world. We call on China to take care of the people with a full heart, because that is the most important thing.
President Tsai Ing-wen also slammed the military drills conducted around the island.
I would like to emphasize that we will not escalate conflicts or provoke disputes, but we will firmly defend our sovereignty and national security and stick to the line of defense of democracy and freedom.
Meanwhile, tensions in the Taiwan Strait have become the top focus of the ongoing ASEAN meeting in Cambodia, with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling the drills a significant escalation.
These provocative actions are a significant escalation. We've seen how Beijing has attempted to change the status quo on Taiwan for some time. For example, more than doubling the number of aircraft flown over the center line that separates China and Taiwan over the past 2 years, pursuing economic coercion, political interference, and cyber attacks against Taiwan. Now, they've taken dangerous acts to a new level. The United States has conveyed to the PRC consistently and repeatedly that we do not seek and will not provoke a crisis. President Tsai has said the same thing. China has chosen to overreact and use Speaker Pelosi's visit as a pretext to increase provocative military activity in and around the Taiwan Strait.
Taiwan is a self-governed island that China considers its own. The US has for decades supported the so-called One China policy, but Washington also says it's against any unilateral change to the status quo, especially by force. During her visit to Taiwan, Pelosi said she supports the island and its people. But now in Japan, Pelosi says her visit does not represent a shift in US policy.
They may try to keep Taiwan from visiting or participating in other places, but they will not isolate Taiwan by preventing us to travel there. We've had high-level visits, senators in the spring, a bipartisan way, continuing visits, and we will not allow them to isolate Taiwan. They are not doing our travel schedule. The Chinese government is not doing that. Our friendship with Taiwan is a strong one. It is bipartisan in the House and the Senate, overwhelming support for peace and the status quo in Taiwan.
Well, our correspondent Susan Tarani is joining us live from New York City for more on this. Well, Susan, we've seen tensions ratcheted up over recent days, all amid this visit by Nancy Pelosi to the island of Taiwan. What do you think these latest moves by Beijing may do to that fragile US-China relationship?
Yeah, the situation is very tense, and I think both sides, really by both sides, I mean Taiwan and the United States, are really acknowledging it, considering the fact that Xi really is in a situation, notably domestically among his own people, that he has to take some sort of action. Nancy Pelosi's trip, on the one hand, put his back against the wall, but on the other hand, you know, these measures and these sort of stopgaps that he's mentioned in terms of cooperation, notably regarding climate, really seems, you know, for a lack of a better word, a joke. I mean, at what point did China really become a spearhead in fighting climate change? It's really never been that way. It has never cooperated really on climate in any way. It's one of the largest climate polluters in the world. But a lot of this is rhetoric, but then you have the military aspects of it, and those are extremely serious right now. And you know, the situation is very frail. What's important to note is that when, for example, Xi Jinping and President Biden would have those telephone conversations, the statements that would come out of the White House was that these lines of communications are open so that things would not escalate, and the United States maintained these lines of communication open so both sides understood where policy-wise each side stood. And, you know, that is where perhaps things will be different right now, because that level of communication, you know, perhaps won't be as transparent anymore.
And Susan, in the last week or so, we've seen that phone call between President Biden and President Xi. There's even been discussion of the two men meeting in person. Does Nancy Pelosi's trip make that somewhat harder to achieve, though?
Yeah, absolutely. The dynamics right now regarding U.S.-Sino relations is different. Things have become very different from that last telephone call, which was really, you know, less than a few weeks ago. And what we're not only seeing right now is between U.S.-China relations, but also China's relations with countries in the region as well. And now the United States is in a position where it has to see to what extent it's willing to defend Taiwan as Nancy Pelosi comes back to Washington and Anthony Blinken is in Cambodia trying to assure America's allies that it has its backs should China continue its saber-rattling activities. So, yeah, the dynamics have definitely changed. It's hard to believe that there will be a Xi-Biden conversation, again, notably because of the domestic policies and politics inside of China and how that would make Xi look among his own people.